Many people will tell you that the 300B is the king of tubes. At least when it comes to speaker amps, instrument amps might be a bit different. And it's safe to say, I think, that a good king deserves a good queen. Is this it? Is the Queenway A-300B speaker amp worthy of the 300B tubes? Are the Pavane 300B tubes that come with the Queenway worthy of it? And what happens if you install over $1,600 worth of tubes into the Queenway tube amp? Let's set up some context first, shall we? The Queenway A-300B is a $2,049 tube-based speaker amp made in China. Some of you will be reaching for the skip button right now, but made in China shouldn't have the stigma attached to it that it sometimes does. Just like every country, China makes some amazing products and some terrible ones. The question here is, which one's the Queenway amp? Or is it just somewhere in the middle? For its $2,000 price tag, the Queenway A-300B ships with 4 Pavane 300B tubes in it. They're branded with the Queenway logo, but they're clearly marketed as Pavane tubes. Those are accompanied by a pair of Svetlana 6SN7 GT tubes and a pair of Pavane ECC82 tubes, which are the same thing as 12AU7s. In other words, unlike some tube amps coming out of China, these are all very readily available tube variants. And that's a good thing because I immediately had to change one of the tubes the moment it arrived. I don't know if maybe the amp got bumped around one too many times in shipping, but from the moment it arrived, one channel was cutting out from time to time, and those signal cutouts were accompanied by a sinister humming noise. It sounded a bit like something was shorting, but I'm not sure. After a swap to some NOS GE6SN7 tubes that I already had here, the issues with the sound disappeared. And so in my opinion, it's a 100% forgivable issue because those sorts of things, as in a faulty tube, can happen to any brand. It's a component, they're a consumable, and they are damageable by things like shaking them around in transit. And so rather than getting hung up on the fact that it arrived with a faulty tube, which, as I said, could happen to any brand, let's talk about how it sounded once I replaced the tubes, because tubes ultimately are consumable. They're not an expensive thing to replace with a fairly basic tube like those Svetlanas, and it's an easy replacement to make. The other reason that I'm keen to move on from it is that the A300B amp from Queenway sounds wonderful. If you want a relatively affordable entry into 300B tube speaker amplification, the Queenway A300B could be worth a swing. And by the way, it offers 3 different RCA inputs. It's got a motorized volume control that reduces the volume when you first switch it on, so you don't hear any of that kind of nasty noise when the tubes are powering up. And then finally, it's also got a remote control, so you can sit back, choose your inputs, and change the volume. The Queenway A300B is also a very heavy amp, weighing in somewhere at around about 3 tons, and it will output 18 watts of power via 4 ohm or 8 ohm speaker taps. And I noticed in my testing that plugging the speakers into the correct tap did make a significant difference. So I'm guessing there are different windings of the transformers, that being the output transformers within the amp, that do make a difference to the sound. I'm using the ProAC Response D2 speakers here. I think I've referred to them as the DB2s in previous reviews. That was a mistake. So it's the ProAC Response D2 speakers, and they clearly sound the best out of the 8 ohm speaker taps. All of the connectors on the back of the amplifier seem to be good quality, and the general build quality I would describe as definitely acceptable for the price. It's not going to set the world on fire, but there's nothing wrong with it. While we're talking about connectors and design and features, it is also worth mentioning that on the top of the amplifier at each end are a couple of adjustment screws for the bias. Unfortunately, the provided manual is very confusing about how to use those bias controls. Now that's fine if you're not going to be swapping tubes because the amplifier comes pre-biased from the factory, but based on the manual, I have no idea how to rebias the amp when I'm swapping tubes, which I've had to do. In case you're not familiar, the term bias refers to how much current is going to the tubes, and ideally, you would rebias the amplifier every time you change the tubes. However, it's not the end of the world if you don't, in my experience. Unless you have tubes that are vastly different from specs, you're not going to have a major shift in sound quality. And for an additional little bit of trivia, if you happen to be new to tubes, when you're buying matched tubes, what you're buying are tubes with the same current draw. And that makes it easier to bias and sometimes means you don't have to bias at all. It all depends on the amp. And so, as I've already said, it's not a big deal that it's hard to bias it, and I haven't rebiased it in my time with it, but at the same time, it would be nice if the manual was a bit clearer about how to do it. But we've gotten off track, again, so let's talk about sound. The Queenway A-300B, and this is with its stock tubes, delivers a wonderful sense of note weight and focus in the image. In other words, all of the instruments are perfectly positioned in space, and they sound like they've got a sense of weight and tangibility to them. They sound present in space as you're listening to your speakers. Some amps I try, the sound is focused, but it's kind of ethereal and thin. With the A300B, they're tangible, they're present, and they're solid. In isolation with the ProAct D2s, the A300B from Queenway was absolutely impressing me. For a point of comparison though, I grabbed my Elekit TU-8200R speaker amp and I loaded it up with some great tubes. All up, my Elekit TU-8200R with its upgraded Lundale output transformers, a set of matched KT88 reserve tubes, and a set of 12 AU7 select tubes, all from Ray Tubes, that total bundle comes to around about $2,000, so comparable in price to the A300B. Starting with the 300B for my listening though, the guitars are crisp and clean in the opening of Rocks. Bryan Adams' vocal is once again wonderfully focused and tangible in the soundstage too. Swapping now over to the 8200R reveals a crisper and cleaner sound from that amp. The image focus is a little bit sharper in defining where each of the instruments is placed, but there's also a little tiny bit less weight to the sound. Onto a different track, and the A300B proves that it's not a thick or warm sounding amp. Until the Ocean Takes Us All, the sound is crisp, it's sparkly, it's even bright at times. Not that the amp is bright, but it's able to deliver the brightness of this track because it's not an overly thick or overly warm sounding amp. Vocals are again nicely separated and focused. The guitars are articulate and clean, and the soundstage is well shaped and well sized. In comparison, the Elekit amp does control the treble just a little bit better on this track. It's still bright and sparkly, but just a touch more refined, I think. Vocals are also well focused, but I think the Elekit does pull ahead again slightly here with a better sense of separation and focus of each of the individual sounds. Other than that, I think the staging size and shape are generally pretty similar between these two, and so the Elekit did win out a little bit for me with its sense of refinement and control. But it's also worth keeping in mind that the Elekit's running on a set of upgraded tubes, whereas the A300B is still in its stock form. Admittedly, in its stock form, it already costs as much as the fully upgraded Elekit, but I could hear from this that the A300B was a solid foundation. It had enough to get us started that maybe it could climb higher with the right tubes. And so I pulled out a full set of upgraded top quality Ray tubes. That meant the Reserve Range 300B tubes, the Reserve Range 6SN7 tubes, and the Select Range 12AU7 tubes. This was sounding special now. Compared to the Elekit that was also still running the Ray tubes, the Queenway A300B was now a more refined sound overall. The 8200R was a tiny bit more articulate still, whereas the 300B was a bit smoother and a bit more relaxed, not lacking in detail though. Technically, the A300B was now a match for the Elekit. It was just a different type of presentation. And the biggest difference was the sense of energy in the music. The KT88 reserve tubes in the Elekit amp are a more energetic tube. The 300B reserve tubes in the A300B amp are a more refined sound, a slightly more laid back sound. But don't let that fool you. The A300B amp was delivering outstanding clarity and separation of sounds. I feel like the bass was also a touch tighter and a little bit less boomy from the A300B. Actually not boomy, but bloomy. It was tighter, it was punchier, it was faster, whereas the Elekit amp was a little bit slower and a little bit bloomier. I think the 300B sounded like it was better controlled. On a setup that's very clean and resolving, like with the Response D2 speakers from ProAct, I feel like the 300B is the easier amplifier to enjoy. On the other hand, the Ella kit delivered a little tiny bit more clarity and insight into the music, so it depends on what you're after. Ultimately, I think the Queenway A-300B is a very interesting amplifier. The one I have here has overcome a bit of a hiccup on the way with that faulty tube, but in overcoming that hiccup, it's proven itself to be a very, very interesting product, and one that I think a lot of people should consider if you want to dip your toes into 300B speaker amplification. There's a reason that 300B tubes have the reputation that they do. They're clean, they're detailed, they provide excellent image focus and image weight, but they're also easy to listen to. And so I'd be really interested to know, have any of you tried the Queenway A-300B? If you have, let us know in the comments, how did you get along? Did you have any faulty tubes? Beyond that though, that's all I can tell you, and I have to leave the rest up to you to decide if this is an amplifier that you want to try. One thing I can tell you though, is that the Ray Tubes 300B reserve tubes are something special, and if you want to know why they've got that grey coating on the inside and why that grey coating actually makes them sound better, then you'll want to watch this video up here next, explaining the difference between basic tubes and premium tubes and why it is actually sometimes worth spending more money. For now though, thank you to YouTube channel members, thank you to channel Patreon members, and thank you to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.